My name is Berenice Howard-Smith. I'm a resident of Cambridge. I am a designer, so that's my main part, my main trade, an artist, a writer, a creative. I also have a little practice, a micro agency called Hello Lovely Design and Co. School of Art, and I have a graphic design and typography master's. So I nerd about fonts a lot. My side thing, which is not really a side thing because it's got quite busy lately, is that I have a CIC, a community interest company called the Stop Community CIC, which is a podcast and an online space that specifically deals with people who are childless not by choice and gives a voice to that unheard minority that walk among us. Democracy for me means being seen and heard and listened to, and about a balance of power. I don't think any of those things necessarily apply that much in democracy all the time, but I feel like it's often the people, in my experience, certainly on a local level, in terms of Cambridge itself, and the every piece of land has a value. And I certainly can see that in terms of developers being heard the loudest. I'm a part of a very small group of, let me get this right because this is important, a small but vocal group of residents, and I can say that's been endorsed by a leading developer in our city at the moment. I'll remain nameless in the case of litigations, but we were called that in a Freedom of Information letter. And in that situation, I think for me, it summed up in a very small way how people who know, live, and love Cambridge, people that have been here for a long time, and communities. I mean, I think anyone who doesn't live in my street, I just feel sorry for you, because actually it's a fantastic street and it's got a lovely WhatsApp group and we're a very lovely community. And it's the thing that keeps me here a lot of the time, is that sense of community. So I think for me, democracy is about seeing communities and recognizing them for the value and the insights that they bring and working with them as opposed to working against them. Certainly in terms of the Beehive development, one of that I got angry. I can't remember when it was. I think it's probably a couple of years ago now. It's been going on for longer than I think people realize. Is the way that the democratic process happened around residents being given a voice around the Beehive, in that leaflets came round very last minute and it was online. So we have a issue, I think, in two things there. The first is that being online can be exclusionary to people who don't have digital skills. You need someone around in order to get you online in the first place so that your voice can be heard as part of a democratic process. And people's time, my time is valuable to me. That's also in terms of money. I run a business. I work for different people. I have the full stop. I have things. I also have family. It's not perhaps most people's society's idea of a family, but I have a family and I have people that I care for as well. So I need to make sure that I've got time to do that. If I'm getting a leaflet through at the very last minute to go and do something that is actually fundamentally critical, certainly at the original height that was proposed, then that really is important that I'm there. It's important that the people in the area have fair voice and are given time to have a fair voice and time to be able to formulate knowledge and learning in an area that they may not be familiar with, because ultimately development, any democracy can change lives. Anything around democracy, whether that's a planning issue, whether it's an exclusion, whether it's not giving people a fair seat at the table and being heard in any way, locally or in a much bigger kind of wider social narrative, then that's a problem, because then it creates a system of them and us and it becomes imbalanced. So from a local level, then I think certainly in Cambridge and seeing it change in the years that I've lived here, we have to give fair weight to residents. I mean, I joke about being a small but vocal resident, and I did think about putting it on a t-shirt and that we'd all just stand there in the Guildhall. But the point is that it was the way that all those things were dealt with, this idea that we had instigated, if I'm allowed to say this. There was an implication in the Freedom of Information letter that we were the ones that were somehow colluding with planning, when in fact, really fundamentally, the problem, and this happens a lot in design, actually, it happens a lot in a lot of things, but there's a correlation with design. If the brief is wrong because the data is wrong and the research hasn't been done, and if I could be right in saying this, that if the entire Beehive planning was based on 84 responses to a survey and not actually a collaborative process with residents who have genuine concerns about the loss of light, daylight, which impacts well-being, which impacts then future generations, because you create a city in which there are pockets that become unlivable, and also affects the climate crisis as well, and urban heat islands, then there is actually a fundamental problem with the brief and with what that comes from and where it's birthed and created from. And therefore, it needs to go back to the drawing board and it needs to start again. Developers have the money to do that, but the people that they leave behind in their wake do not, and shouldn't really ever be unfairly blamed for this. And that, I think, is what happens commonly in Cambridge. And then conversations happen behind closed doors. With the best will in the world, I know our planning department do the best they can, but when things happen away from residents, it creates silos. And then people don't want to engage in their city. Then Cambridge becomes full of dead pockets where really there needs to be vibrancy and understanding. And the people need to feel that their voice is heard. It's really hard to make planning sexy. It is not. I'm sorry, planning department. You're probably all very lovely and good looking, but actually, planning is not sexy. It's really boring and full of big words. But actually, it is so critical that people take a moment to get involved in what is going on in their doorstep and understand what planning is and what it isn't, because it's not about the loss of shops, it's about actually more important structural issues that will impact and set precedents for the rest of the city. So even if you don't live near something that's going to be twice as tall as the housing around it and creates an urban heat island, it will probably affect your area, because Cambridge isn't that big a city, although it's growing rapidly. But it also then sets a precedent for other parts of the city. And that, I think, for me, is the bit that people just need to be aware of. It affects you, even if you think it doesn't, it does. So it's important that people engage with it, I think, in a way that is helpful, but also, I think, truthful. And trying to find out the truth, I know, can be quite hard. There are lots and lots of places online where you can find out a lot of misinformation, I think, about lots of things, including, I think, planning issues in Cambridge. So I think being aware of getting the facts right, I think, is important. Do your research, because yeah, that's really important too. I went on about planning, didn't I? Where can I go next? I know we're going to go next. The other thing I want to go next on to, if that's okay, is around perhaps a wider thing, because I know that the topic of this, which really stood out to me and made me just go, yeah, I want to be part of this, is about having a seat at the table. And one of the early podcasts that the Full Stop did was with Civilla Morgan. Civilla Morgan lives in America, and she was talking about the impact of Mother's Day on her as a childless not by choice woman, who had recently lost her mother and had gone into her church and found that all the women who were parents were given a flower. And she had to sit there with the grief of her mother, or the grief of the loss of her mother, and the grief of not being a mother. And she went to the people who look after her church and she said, I don't think this is right. And that became the start of her podcast, this fight to be heard. And one of the things that she said is, if you don't speak up, then you don't get a seat at the table. And I feel that's very, very true. And I'm passionate about this, about childless people. There are 20% of women are childless. There is an estimated, and this is an estimate, 25% of men are childless not by choice. And the reason it's an estimate is because the Office of National Statistics don't record men. So childless men are completely unheard. There is no voice for them. It's one of those weird things where we talk about mansplaining and about the voices of men, and actually in childlessness, and to a degree, I think in child-free as well, where men's voices are less heard and men can be judged. And the person who told me this statistic is Dr. Robin Hadley, and I give all credit to him for this and his research, which is extensive over childless men and childless men's infertility. He's an incredible person to talk to about this. So they have even less of a voice at the table when it comes to this and their well-being. International Men's Day this year, as it has been with all preceding years, is led by pictures that generally the imagery looks like it's men and their sons. So not even in International Men's Day, and actually, to be fair, not even in International Women's Day are childless women and child-free women generally recognised either. So we're excluded from lots of things. You then have things like in Mother's Day, you have Father's Day, which will both happen at different times of the year, depending on where you live in the world. And there is nothing really that honours, I think, the untold support and the way that childless people have to navigate what is a very pronatal world. My thing with democracy, the thing I would love is to see that childless people are recognised as a protected characteristic. Because when we think about all the protected characteristics, childlessness underpins quite a few. There certainly is, for every awareness day that there is that's around physical and mental health, I could bring you a speaker who is childless. And that, I think, is very telling. But we don't have a seat at the table. I have been to a weekend, and we were just talking about this in Storyhouse Childless in Chester. And one of the things that we talked about, and it is a whole weekend in a lovely venue, and it's inclusive to everyone who is childless, not by choice, or child-free. And in talking to Jodie Day, who established Gateway Women many years ago, and was the only voice that I could find, along with the journalist B.B. Lynch, talking about childlessness at that time. We think there's around 50 ways not to be a mother. Brackets, apologies to Paul Simon. That is Jodie's article, and I recommend anyone goes and reads it, because it's never as simple as you think. And in this event, we were talking about bingos to the tune of DISCO, so BINGO, and all those common things that we all call bingos. So B is, or my kids. Yeah, mine. I don't want them anymore. That's fine. Ha ha ha, funny. If you thought about that in any other context of the loss of a sibling, a parent, a grandparent, even a pet, that's really, really not on. But actually, in terms of an invisible grief, a disenfranchised grief, it's a really cruel way to deflect other people's discomfort. And in my experience, childlessness always brings up other people's discomfort. I have spoken locally about this in a newspaper twice. The first occasion was not particularly pleasant. I talked about the need for IVF being taken off in workplaces. It's seen as a cosmetic treatment. And I've been through it 6 times. And I can assure you there is nothing cosmetic about IVF at all. It's grueling, it is painful, it is not a choice for many people. It's the last chance saloon. It's the bit where you really don't want to go. And there is a massive mental health issue in terms of what happens when it doesn't work, because people aren't spoken about. Louise Brown is in her 40s, and the fail rate for IVF is somewhere around 72%. And yet I have been told I didn't try hard enough, that I should think of all the orphans, and I am a cruel and bitter woman. And I have post-traumatic stress disorder, and I have been through all this, and I hear this often. So the seat at the table for people who are childless not by choice is absolutely needed, because without it, there are huge implications. There is this idea currently of falling fertility rates. And I say that with little quote marks, because actually a lot of it is not addressing why people aren't having children. We're always told in schools, I certainly was, how not to get pregnant. But actually, trying to get pregnant when you can't, and being offered useful advice and fixes like, just put your legs in the air, borrow my husband. Or as my co-presenter and co-director on the CIC, Michael was told by his boss at work, I just have to drop my trousers and my wife's pregnant. And that's the kind of language that happens. And it's dangerous, it's toxic. And because we're not shown in democracy, for example, the wonderful Marmalade Street in Cambridge, it's beautiful, it's wonderful. I looked at that because I'm going to be aging on my own. There's a good chance of that. I am married, but there's a good chance for different reasons, for private reasons, that I might be aging alone. And I thought that could be a thing. There are communal spaces and it's family. How do I show up as a childless person surrounded by families? In aging, who will care for me? In dementia, so in dementia treatment, often women are given dolls to nurture. If you haven't had a child and you can't advocate for yourself, what damage will be giving that doll do to someone who has never had children? How do they articulate that emotion? And okay, yeah, it might be that people are listening to this and going, well, actually, you know, there's quite a lot of parents out there who won't have children to care for them. And statistically, actually, it's more likely that childless women will care for an aging relative than a woman who is a parent, because we apparently have nothing else to do. Is that fair? I don't think that's fair. But we're not talked about like that. No one thanks us for those things. And yes, there is estrangement. There's a fantastic charity called Aging Without Children who predict a crisis in 2030 where people who are estranged from their children or aging alone without children for whatever reason will have no care. I will be one of them. There will be 20% of women who will be in that situation. Yet, if I mention that anywhere, well, you should have thought that before. But actually, no one has a guarantee that they're going to have children in their life that are going to care for them. There is estrangement everywhere. So it's not up to us as childless people to fix this, but no government talks about this. When Keir Starmer came to power, and my politics are my politics, and I will say right now that the far right and JD Vance and all of that toxic narrative weaponize childless people. They demonize them. We are rapidly going back to the point where we are going to be literally going to be burning childless women at the stake if we're not careful. That's another reason why it's really important to recognize that some people choose not to have children, to respect that. And I respect that entirely. I'm well up for allyship with my childless, my child-free friends, and I learn a lot from them, and they suffer badly too. But also to create this bit where pronatalism becomes toxic means that you are then, people are then overriding the grief of not being a mother, not being a father, not being a parent. And that's really dangerous because it is a grief. Okay, I didn't get to meet my children, but they were still my children. I still mother in other ways. We can't have this narrative anymore, I think, where it's as a mother, as a father. You can't measure love. I still feel love. I still have emotions. I actually have been through so much, and so have so many people that I have met who are childless, not by choice, have so much empathy because they have seen real loss. I have been through more than most people should ever do in a lifetime because of what I've been through. So the trying to be a child, for the comments that I get, the bingoisms, and having to deal with that and other people's discomfort. I'm so over dealing with other people's discomfort. I mean, frankly, if you're listening to this and you think, oh God, I said that thing, well, learn from it. If you have said to somebody, actually, you didn't try hard enough, or it's God's way, or you weren't cut out to be a mother, I never thought you were maternal, then I like to kind of go, oh, because that's uncomfortable, and that is that person's discomfort to own. It is no longer mine. But I've had to do 15 years of therapy to get to that point, and no one should have to do 15 years of therapy that I had to pay for to get to the point where I can sit here today and go, actually, we need a seat at the table. I demand a seat at the table, and I demand that people listen to me, because the government's idea and the far right's idea, in fact, every single political party's idea of what a family is not mine. but I still have a family and I still have a right to vote. I pay my taxes and I show up and I demand a seat at your table. I imagine and hope that a democracy would have non-parents, child-free, childless, whatever the word is, recognized as a protected characteristic, so that when people are considering what they're doing in life, whether that's a workshop, whether it's planning, whether it's creating a housing initiative, that they have thought and have considered and addressed the needs of people who don't have children. So that places like Marmalade Street, like National Loneliness Awareness, any campaign, any day, or any venture is inclusive and safe. It should not be that I go to an event in Chester, all those miles away up the M6, every year that's become this cult thing. Cult thing, maybe not probably the West word, but it's become an event, a space of well-being and inclusion and safety, and set up in such a way that it's inclusive and safety to people who are otherwise unheard. That should be something that happens all the time, because actually it's not that difficult to do. It's simply removing probably one key question. Are you a parent? Because that's actually largely unnecessary. There are other questions to ask. And if you can start with that, then I think that becomes a springboard to lots of other conversations, lots of other points of inclusion. For example, on the local level, there would be perhaps more messaging, more research, I think, over planning issues as well, because it would include other areas. For example, the Beehive, there's lots of stuff they want to do on that, I think, long term around events and things like that. Well, okay, let's make sure those events and those art spaces are for everybody, that they're real parents collaboration, and I say that with the quotes again, with community groups are community groups that are generally family driven. Where are the community inclusion groups for people who don't have families? Where are they getting involved in things like, I don't know, cherry trees and groups around that do other stuff, more around the queer community? Why aren't they supporting that? It's not just about people who have kids, because actually other people, lots of people use that estate, use those shops. So let's talk to them, talk to the homeless societies that we have that do amazing work at Winter Comfort. Let's get some conversations going that are not just geared around the family groups as well, because actually a lot of people sit within those wider demographics. So that's my idea, I think, for democracy. That's what I long for, is to have childlessness and child-free as protected characteristics.